Okay, so today, get this. We are diving into Shaka Zulu versus Genghis Khan.
Wow.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Talk about a historical showdown.
A listener actually suggested this one.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I've got to hand it to him. It's a fascinating matchup. Two of history's most iconic warlords, each with their own unique approach to, well, conquering.
Right. I mean, it's like, who would win in a fight, a lion or a tiger?
Exactly. And that's what we're here to unpack today.
Totally. So where do we even begin with this face-off? They're from completely different eras, different continents, different everything.
Well, for starters, let's just acknowledge the elephant in the room, or what should I say, the Zulu warrior and the Mongol horseman.
Haha, good one.
These guys were both masters of warfare, but their styles were about as different as their backgrounds. We've got Shaka Zulu revolutionizing warfare in the African savanna, facing off against Genghis Khan, the master of the Eurasian steppe.
They're right. Talk about a study in contrasts. And that's what makes this so fascinating. But before we throw them into a theoretical showdown, let's get to know our contenders a bit better, shall we? Starting with Shaka.
Sounds good to me.
You know him. You might even have a poster of him, the Napoleon of Africa. I have to say, that nickname always makes me think, did Shaka really need to be compared to a European conqueror to be considered great?
It's a good point. Shaka's legacy stands on its own, and his innovations were arguably even more radical than Napoleon's, especially considering the context.
Right.
Remember, he wasn't born into power like Napoleon. Shaka inherited a relatively small tribe in what's now South Africa. But he had this vision, this burning ambition to transform his people into an unstoppable force.
Ambition check. But he also had some seriously impressive military know-how. Like, this guy takes a short stabbing spear, the Ikwa, and basically rewrites the rules of close combat.
It's iconic.
I was reading about this. The Ikwa wasn't meant for throwing like traditional spears. It was all about getting up close and personal with the enemy. Can you imagine the sheer intensity of that?
It's a level of aggression and discipline that's hard to fathom today. Before Shaka, Zulu warriors primarily relied on throwing spears from a distance. The Ikwa changed everything. It demanded incredible strength and precision, not to mention nerves of steel.
And the way they used it, I mean, the bullhorn formation, it's almost poetic in its brutality. Can you imagine being on the receiving end of that?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to. Imagine this. You're facing the Zulu army, and they divide into these three distinct parts. The chest charges straight at you, engaging the enemy head-on. But while you're distracted, the horns swing out to the sides in a wide flanking maneuver, effectively encircling your forces. Complete.
Brutal.
Absolute.
It's a terrifying combination of tactical brilliance and raw, visceral force. And it's no wonder the Zulus saw such rapid expansion under Shaka's rule.
He was a game changer. But let's not forget about his counterpart in this epic duel, Genghis Khan, a name that still inspires awe and terror centuries later. His story is like something out of a Hollywood movie, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Born Temujin, a nobody in a world of warring tribes, he unified the Mongols and carved out an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. It's mind-boggling.
And it all goes back to those horses. We often picture Mongol warriors as these fierce horsemen, but their equestrian skills were more than just impressive. They were the backbone of their entire military strategy.
Right. I mean, the Mongols were practically born on horseback, but Genghis Khan took it to another level.
Exactly. Their cavalry was incredibly mobile, covering vast distances with a speed that would make your head spin. We're talking up to 100 miles a day. They could appear out of thin air, rain down arrows on their enemies, and vanish before anyone knew what hit them.
Talk about a logistical nightmare for their opponents. I mean, how do you even begin to defend against an enemy that can move that quickly and strike from that far away?
That's the one. You're starting to see why Genghis Khan was such a formidable opponent. But his true genius lay in his understanding of strategy, something that went far beyond just being a skilled horseman.
Okay, so we're talking about two very different military styles here, right? Shaka Zulu, the master of close combat and psychological warfare, and Genghis Khan, the lightning-fast strategist with an empire-building mindset. It's almost like comparing apples and oranges, or should I say, assegai and arrows.
A very fitting analogy.
Yeah.
And to really understand who would come out on top in this hypothetical clash of civilizations, we need to break down their skills even further. Let's pit their speed, strength, intelligence, and even their special abilities against each other. Only then can we truly crown a victor in this battle for the ages.
So we've got these two legendary figures, each a military rock star in their own right. But what made them tick? What were the key ingredients in their recipe for, shall we say, victory?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when you dig a little deeper, you realize that it wasn't just about brute force with these guys.
Right.
They were both incredibly strategic thinkers.
Okay, so tactics over brawn, I like it,
Look.
but how did that actually play out on the battlefield?
Take Shaka Zulu, for example.
The Ikwa king.
Exactly. He completely revolutionized Zulu warfare. Before him, they were all about throwing spears from a distance. But Shaka, he recognized the power of close combat, of breaking the enemy's lines and instilling fear.
Ah, the psychological game.
Precisely. It wasn't just about physical strength, but mental dominance. And that's where the Ikwa, that short stabbing spear, comes in.
It's such a brutal weapon, though.
Oh, absolutely.
Sure.
But it was also incredibly effective. And it required a whole different kind of training, a whole different mindset. Shaka's warriors were drilled relentlessly, trained to fight as a single, terrifying unit.
Like a well-oiled stabbing machine.
You could say that, and it worked. The Zulus, under Shaka's leadership, became this almost unstoppable force in southern Africa.
Okay, impressive. But then we have Genghis Khan operating on a whole other scale.
Right. I mean, talk about thinking big.
World domination was the name of his game.
And he very nearly achieved it. But here's the thing about Genghis Khan. He understood that you can't build an empire by just being a one-trick pony. He was a master of adaptation.
Adaptation.
Think about the diversity of the Mongol Empire. Deserts, mountains, forests, steppes, they conquered it all. And each environment demanded a different approach, different tactics.
So he was like a chameleon, blending in and adapting to whatever came his way.
Exactly. He adopted new technologies, incorporated foreign soldiers into his ranks. Heck, he even learned from his enemies, using their own tactics against them when it suited him.
Talk about resourceful. So he was flexible, but also, let's be honest, pretty ruthless.
Oh, without a doubt. But that was part of his effectiveness. His enemies feared him, and that fear was a powerful weapon in itself.
Yeah, I bet it was. But fear alone doesn't win wars, does it?
No, you also need to keep those armies fed, equipped, and on the move. And that brings us to logistics, the often overlooked but absolutely crucial aspect of warfare.
The nuts and bolts behind the battlefield.
Exactly. And this is another area where Genghis Khan truly excelled. He understood that the well-supplied army was a happy army, or at least a less likely to mutiny army.
Makes sense.
He established supply lines, created a messenger system using relay riders, even developed an early form of passport for safe passage throughout the empire.
He was like a one-man postal service.
In a way, yes. And all of this allowed him to maintain control over this vast, sprawling empire. It was an incredible feat of organization.
Okay, so we're talking about two very different leadership styles here, but both incredibly effective in their own way. It's almost like comparing, I don't know, a scalpel and a sledgehammer.
I like that.
Both can get the job done, but in very different ways. But ultimately, it all comes down to the man behind the weapon, or in this case, the leader behind the army.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this face-off so fascinating. We're not just talking about military tactics and technology. We're talking about two of history's most compelling and enigmatic figures.
So how do we even begin to compare their leadership styles?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? How do you compare two leaders who were operating in such different contexts, facing such different challenges?
It's like trying to compare apples and oranges.
It's more like apples and, I don't know, a battering ram.
Okay, yeah, that's even better.
But here's the thing. I think focusing on who would win in a direct fight might be missing the point.
Okay, so if it's not about crowning a victor, what's the takeaway here?
It's about understanding what made each of these leaders so exceptional. Shaka Zulu was a master of innovation and adaptation within his own sphere. He saw the limitations of traditional Zulu warfare and said, we can do better. And he did. He transformed his army into a force to be reckoned with, and he did it all on his own terms.
He really flipped the script on warfare in southern Africa, didn't he?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's a testament to his leadership, his vision, his sheer audacity. But then we have Genghis Khan operating on a whole other level.
Let's talk about a global vision.
Right. This is a guy who conquered more land in his lifetime than almost anyone in history. And he did it by understanding that adaptability wasn't just about changing tactics, it was about changing your entire mindset.
So it was more of a philosophical approach to conquest.
You could say that. Genghis Khan understood that to build a lasting empire, you couldn't just rely on brute force. You needed to be smart, you needed to be organized, and you needed to be willing to learn from anyone, even your enemies.
He was kind of a sponge for knowledge, wasn't he? Always absorbing new ideas, new technologies.
Exactly. And that's a really important lesson for anyone, not just aspiring conquerors.
So what you're saying is there's a little bit of Shaka Zulu and a little bit of Genghis Khan in all of us.
Maybe? But in all seriousness, I think their stories highlight the importance of adaptability, of strategic thinking, of recognizing that there's always more to learn.
It's about recognizing your strengths, but also being willing to step outside your comfort zone, to embrace new ideas, new ways of doing things.
Exactly. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive. We've explored two incredibly different leaders, two incredibly different approaches to warfare, and I hope we've given our listeners a lot to think about.
We've journeyed from the savannas of Africa to the steppes of Asia, and along the way, I think we've uncovered some pretty timeless truths about leadership, strategy, and the human condition. And who knows, maybe next time you're facing a challenge, whether it's a tricky work project or a particularly competitive game of Monopoly, you'll channel your inner Shaka Zulu or Genghis Khan. Adapt, strategize, and most importantly, never give up. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.